All right, so yeah, I want to welcome everybody, whether you're in our biochemical sciences community or coming from our broader UW-Madison community. I feel like I should begin this event by pointing out how many great opportunities there are this week to spend time not only on the nuts and bolts of the science we're currently doing, but how our science can benefit by mindfully changing practices about how we welcome people into science and foster excellence within it. So there are events in our biochemical sciences community and without. I'll leave full details for referencing either the email from Christina Hull or the Google. But tomorrow through Friday include the 2020 UW-Madison Diversity Forum, a conversation with Doctors Alex Gee and Karen Reese about building anti-racist cultures, the inaugural Diversity and Science Symposium at UCSD, which our own Judy Simcox has been closely involved in, and breakout sessions with our biochemical sciences community to reflect on and organize around things we've learned this week. So I hope you'll be able to attend more events this week, and I'm really glad to welcome you here for today's discussion about building an inclusive culture in STEM education. My name is Tina Lynch. I'm a graduate student in the integrated program in biochemistry. So together with the chair of the Biochemistry Colloquium Committee, Dr. Judith Kimball, and the chair of the Biochemistry DEI Committee, Dr. Judy Simcox, we have the honor of hosting today's Biochemistry Colloquium speaker, Dr. Tracy Johnson. Dr. Johnson is at UCLA, and her name is probably already familiar to you for one or more of the following reasons. Because of her group's pioneering science at the intersection of splicing and chromatin, because of the exceptional recognition she's received throughout her career, most recently being appointed Dean of the Division of Life Sciences at UCLA College, because of her leadership in arenas such as the Executive Committee for the Annual Biomedical Research Conference for Minority Students, or ABRCAMS. Maybe she's already a respected colleague of yours. I know she has many friends at UW-Madison, and some are here today. And you might also have seen her speak about her work on how introns can influence translation in Biochemistry Colloquium earlier this month. So one of the few benefits about being virtual is that we can welcome Dr. Johnson back so soon to speak with us. And today we'll be talking about how to make a culture of inclusive excellence in STEM. I'll try to keep this short and briefly highlight basically the names of some of Dr. Johnson's projects, because I think she'll talk about them in her seminar. But she's co-PI on the NIH-funded Uplift, or IRA CDA program, which partners UCLA postdocs with CSULA instructors for innovative teaching. She also founded the UCLA HHMI Pathways to Success program, which creates a network that sets undergraduate researchers up for success. Dr. Johnson will give a seminar called Beyond Diversity, Building a Culture of Inclusion in STEM Education. And after the seminar, there will be an hour-long open and interactive discussion. Judy Simcox will help guide the conversation, and our goal is that this session will be productive towards thinking about which initiatives to invest in to build a lasting culture of inclusion in our biochemical sciences community. So with that, Dr. Johnson, thank you for coming back, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Tina. Is the volume okay for you? Thank you for having me back. I'd like to thank you for that really kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to get to speak at this biochemistry colloquium. You know, for a number of years, institutions like yours and like mine have been talking about diversity, whether it's important, the lack of it, how do we get there? And then this year, with the very public murders of George Floyd, only one of a seemingly endless account of murders of unarmed Black people, there's been a real reckoning with just how deeply racism and its toxic effects are embedded in our society. And of course, the academy and indeed science has had to reckon with the fact that we are part of a larger society, making it really impossible to be completely free of the toxic effects of racism and discrimination. Many institutions and societies, et cetera, have been making statements of solidarity with people of color, Black and Indigenous folks, And similarly, some similar statements may have taken place at your institution, and really um, doubling down on a commitment to the value of diversity. And just as there's been a reckoning in the larger society to come to terms with the systems that reinforce inequities and disparities, we're having those same important conversations in science. And we're having those same conversations at our respective universities, institutions, campuses. This is why I'm really honored to get a chance to participate in this conversation today. I'm going to start by saying a few things about the way I've been and my institution has been thinking about this, and then I'm excited that we'll have a chance to open it up for a broader discussion. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay. Think that, Tina, if you can just nod and let me know that we're all good to go. Excellent. All right, so what I really want to start with is to talk a little bit about the what and why. There's been a lot of, as we said before, a lot of discussion of diversity and increasing diversity, but it's really important to understand what we mean by that. So this is a general outline of what I'm going to talk about today, a bit of framework for understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, what we mean, why we're even having this conversation, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the how, which is some case studies of some of the ways in which we're engaging in these conversations um, at different institutions. And I'm going to focus in on some of the work that we're doing at UCLA, again, to open up the conversation more broadly. So that we're all on the same page, I'd like to just start by telling you kind of how I'm thinking about this. So, what do we just defining the terms? What do we mean by diversity? Diversity is essentially the way I'm going to be describing it is a composition of different elements, whether that's ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups, racial groups. So diversity in is this kind of collection of individuals with unique elements. Inclusion, on the other hand, is the practice of providing equal access, opportunities, resources, and a sense of belonging. So it doesn't take a lot to know that diversity and inclusion are not the same. And so I've been thinking about and have heard it described. Diversity is more reflective of numbers. Who's there? Inclusion is a reflection of a feeling. What does it mean to be included? And the way or the mode of going from diversity to inclusion is equity. So I'd like to just unpack this a little bit more. So the question of diversity, I mean, there are lots of ways to think about diversity. Here's an example where there are different elements in a collection, and it's clearly diverse. Um, and then another way of looking at it is another example of diversity where there are different individuals. So these may both represent what looks like diversity, but very clearly these are not the same as inclusion. And in fact, even though bringing individuals into the group may look like the beginning of operationalizing diversity, the reality is nothing about this group in green has to change in order for the other individuals to be incorporated. So, what we really mean by inclusion is the true integration of individuals within the group, the difference between diversity and inclusion. But even looking at this, the reality is that if we think of inclusion as a feeling, it's hard to imagine that simply looking at this picture is the mode to getting to inclusion. So, inclusion is fully realized, there has to be a change in the feeling of the individuals in the group. So, one of the ways I've thought about it is diversity is like being invited to a party. Inclusion is like having a seat at the table. But true inclusion, true cultural transformation, where it's different for everybody within the community, is evident when individuals are truly glad that they're there. So, any individual or any graduate student or undergraduate who's been part of diversity initiatives, they can tell you very clearly that there's a difference between diversity, even a difference between inclusion, and a difference in that feeling of deep cultural transformation and the feeling of inclusion. So, to get from diversity to inclusion is clearly not a passive is not passive. It requires action. And in that action has to be informed through a lens of equity. And so just as there is a continuum with respect to diversity and a continuum with respect to inclusion, one can imagine there's also a continuum with respect to equity. So for decades, it's been an aspiration to achieve equality, whereby everything is the same for different individuals without recognition necessarily of the barriers of those individuals. Then equality is simply not good enough. I think that's illustrated very clearly here, where equality is being achieved, but it isn't benefiting those individuals. Now, let me be clear. There is nothing wrong with the individuals in this picture. They're different, but the structures in place disproportionately disadvantage some over others. Structures could be systemic racism, social inequality, homophobia, all kinds of features of this environment could create those disadvantages that disproportionately affect the individuals in this group. So, equity is creating an environment where it's possible for individuals to come to the game with their differences and their unique strengths and still thrive. And yet, the problem with even this vision of equity is that it still assumes that there is this barrier that is in place. Truly getting at inclusion is removing barriers and so that the individuals can feel equally engaged and equally valued. But I would say going even one step further, true cultural transformation is when the offense is completely gone. It means changing the game completely such that individuals who are there can fully participate in the community. So in thinking about the distinction between diversity and then getting to inclusion, clearly the way we think about equity and elimination of barriers that are systemic within the culture is critical. One note that I'm going to come back to is if we think about these barriers and whose responsibility it is to remove them. So, as each of us are thinking about in our own institutional contexts, what is important to each of us? This is a really self-reflective kind of question, and it's important to really ask oneself and be critical about the answers. In our institutions, have we somehow decided that diversity is enough? Is that the end goal? And also have a very clear answer of why diversity is important at all. Without having answers to this, it's very difficult to move toward cultural transformation. But then the next question is inclusion or cultural transformation even a goal? And if it is, then why? And then finally, are we willing to do the work that it takes? And coming back to this picture, the difference between the image on the left and the image on the right is removal of barriers. The question is whose responsibility is this to remove the barriers? This wasn't created by these individuals. It's really those individuals who benefit the most from those barriers whose responsibility it should be to remove them. And I think thinking about this picture once more, it is quite possible that each of these individuals in their individual communities have no deficits. that these individuals thrive within those communities, but it is these structural barriers that create the inequities, hence the need to remove them. So, to frame our discussion, I'm going to say a little bit about how at UCLA we've been thinking about this question. Why is inclusion important? And we've been thinking about this in terms of really three answers. And I'll say we because I've been at UCLA for now about 7, 8 years and have been deeply involved in conversations to ask really some tough questions about how we get from diversity to inclusion. And some of the philosophies that are driving the work is that our objective is to train and to educate the next generation of world-class scientists and researchers. And the philosophy is that losing out on the extraordinary talent is completely unacceptable. That science and the culture of science is in fact better with inclusion of diverse voices because the questions that we ask, the interpretation of the observations, and what we do with the information is transformed by who does science. And then finally, similar to your institution, we're a public institution, meaning that our obligation is really to develop the rich talent that's reflected in the demographics of the state. So with this as a framework, what is the task ahead? And so, and finally, just to summarize, the idea that we perpetuate exclusion and by not um, dismantling barriers, we in fact would be perpetuating exclusion is simply not sustainable for our institution or for science in general. So the framework within which I'm going to talk about some specific case studies today is the idea that's shown here. We visualize the aspiration of student success, regardless of student background, to involve three critical elements. Really thinking deeply about student engagement, faculty development, and deep understanding of and transformation of pedagogy and curricula. So I'm going to now, with having talked a bit about the framework and some definitions, I'm going to talk about a specific example of how we're engaging students in a way that to achieve um, diversity, inclusion, and transformation. So I'm going to just give a bit of context for why we're really needing to rethink our approach to inclusion, particularly when it comes to our undergraduate population. So these are the national statistics that about 40% of students in general who start with an intention to study STEM graduate with STEM degrees in 5 years. Among students who are from traditionally underrepresented groups, which are indicated here, that number drops to about 22%. And so this isn't students that leave the university, these are students who leave STEM. UCLA is a top tier, research one public institution. And yet, when we look at our numbers, they're not as grim as the national statistics, but certainly they have not been numbers to be proud of because of the disparity between the number of students who persist from underrepresented groups compared to students from majority students. Now, these students graduate, they're just not graduating in STEM. An easy explanation might be, well, those students are simply not prepared, or maybe those students are not capable. But what we in fact find is that the incoming GPA of the students of all students compared to students who are coming from underrepresented groups are insignificant, the difference between them. So it means that we are losing good students. And the question is, or we have been losing good students, and that raised the question is, how can we develop best practices that work for all students that don't disproportionately disadvantage students from underrepresented groups? And how can we affect student outcomes? So as we do, when we're just trying to figure out how to solve a scientific problem, there's actually excellent literature to help us to begin to think about how we can make a difference. And I particularly want to highlight this work from Mika Estrada analyzed about 1,000 science students from underrepresented groups who are involved in various types of research activities. And what she found was that skills and abilities are poor predictors of whether a student will persist in science. That a good predictor of persistence is what she calls scientific identification. And so in the study, they found that when a student assumes the identity of a scientist, they're more likely to follow the norms and the roles to pursue careers in science. So going back to this example, thinking about inclusion, the difference between incorporation and inclusion, we might be able to attract students to the university and to STEM degrees, but the Estrada's work would indicate that in order to see full integration, full participation, full feeling of belonging, students need to identify as scientists. So um, in order to leverage this data, I was fortunate enough to be awarded HHMI professorship in 2014. And from that, as Tina mentioned, I developed the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, UCLA Pathways to Success program, which is a multi-tiered approach to student persistence that really focused on what does it take to help foster a sense of scientific identity. And I'm going to tell you about a key component of that, which is the Collaborative Undergraduate Research Lab. So this is a research course that is based on this question: what kind of student experience is needed to build scientific identity? And the data say that it's in fact the kind of early engaged course-based research experiences that make a fundamental difference. And so the conclusion, for example, of this study showed that across demographics, students who engaged in authentic research experiences were more likely to persist in scientific disciplines and assume a sense of scientific identity. So I'll tell you a little bit about the course just to get a sense of what is embedded in it to reinforce this sense of identity. So it's designed to be an exploratory lab. The students know that the goal is to generate publishable results. There's a didactic piece so that students from all backgrounds will start at a level playing field. They attend scientific seminars. They write a grant proposal. Again, these are first year students, so they write an NIH style grant proposal. And of course, that's for their midterm. They revise and resubmit like we all do for their final exam. And then they do a final oral presentation. So this is the format of the class. And if, for those of you who were at my seminar a few weeks ago, you might know that my lab studies RNA splicing. And given that that is really the research that I know, that was the launching point for the collaborative undergraduate research lab. So the project was connected to my lab's research. So I'll tell you a little bit about what the project was. So the students carried out a yeast genetic screen to identify suppressors of a temperature sensitive mutant in a splicing factor. Um, and then spent 10 weeks analyzing and characterizing the mutant, characterizing the effects on splicing, the suppressor's effect on splicing, and then some bioinformatic analysis to identify the site at which the insertion mutagenesis took place that led to the suppression. So I'm not going to go into details. There are some of the suppressors, the RNA splicing analysis, the bioinformatics data, and I'm hopefully next time, if we're in person, I can tell you a couple of the stories that we're in the process of writing up based on the work that came from the students in the class. But I just want to highlight that the way in which the students engaged in the class from their freshman year was with the assumption that what they were doing was science and that they were generating results that were where the intention was for publication. There are some of the students who were presenting in their final research presentations, and they presented in front of faculty and postdocs at UCLA. But I think what I'm most proud of is when I look at the pre and post assessment of the students in the course. And so we analyze both performance in particular topics or scientific topics. And so I'm not going to say a lot about that. The students, even if it is a subject that isn't specifically being addressed in the class, like sort of some of the chemistry concepts, before and after the class, their ability to work through problems is dramatically improved. But what I like to highlight here is just the attitude or the sense of self-efficacy that the students describe. So when we ask them if they understand, if they feel like they understand what it's like to do research in a lab, what's shown in blue is the pre-course, and then in red is the post-course. And I just want to emphasize that there may even be students who start at different places, but are able to achieve a sense that they understand what a laboratory experience looks like by changing the way we engage students as scientists. And this is illustrating just kind of the numbers. This is one particular class or subset of a class, and here's a 6-year average. Similarly, when we ask the other critical question, whether the students would consider themselves scientists, again, what's shown in blue is the pre-course survey, and then what's shown in red is post-course. And this is one quote that I particularly like from one of the students in the class who describes learning what it means to be a scientist and loving it. It turns out this student is now in his first year of an MD PhD program at Columbia. So the difference, though, I think illustrates that in the course of changing the way we teach science, we can change the sense of scientific identity. And again, here's the average over 6 years of the course. So the question is, what do students do um, post the collaborative undergraduate research lab? Well, nearly all of them pursue some form of mentored research experience. And I particularly like to highlight what the 5-year retention rate is for students who participate in the program, and we're at about 97% retention. These are some of the students who participate in the program at a poster session, um, at UCLA, and then some of the students at the annual Biomedical Research Conference for minority students, or ABRCAMS, showing off their awards. Um, I also just want to highlight some of the other achievements, because oftentimes when we think about kind of how do we create experiences for students, we lose sight of the fact that each of these individuals can play a critical role because of what they can go on to do. So here's some of the students at one of the graduations, and it's just a little bit about what they've gone on to do. And I think that this particular slide is one that I am particularly excited about, because these are students who graduated in the last year, along with the publications that their publications from their undergraduate research. And I point this out for the following reason: that we simply can't leave it up to serendipity, that students will experience something that will engage them in the sense that they are scientists and that they adopt scientific identity, that we have to actively think about the environment in which the education is taking place. And it can't be simply fixing students, which has been kind of one of the traditional models, but really changing the way we engage students in learning and education, with the assumption that with that, those students are fully capable of scientific and academic success, and that they'll thrive. So I want to just take a moment to, before I go on to the rest of my talk, I want to take a moment to acknowledge some of the key reasons why, besides having support from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, it really is key to have a support system. For example, the previous Dean of Life Sciences, Victoria Sork, who was incredibly supportive of being able to identify lab space, and to develop the infrastructure to facilitate being able to pilot this type of course, which we're now expanding to larger groups of students. And these are individuals who have been researchers in my lab. So Azad is a research scientist who helped develop the lab with me. The bioinformatics was developed by Stephen Douglas, who's now in a faculty position at Connecticut College. And these are all three graduate students who I've been lucky enough to have in my lab who also TA'd for the course. And so I point this out because often we think about like who can participate in fundamental cultural change. And what I'd like to highlight here is that I, in their ways, all of these individuals on this slide were crucial to the success of the of the of the lab, and I'd say have remained in as mentors as to the students who participated in the collaborative undergraduate research lab. So coming back to this idea of what does it take to achieve scientific student success? And again, I mentioned that this stool we see as having really three critical legs. I've said a bit about thinking deeply about how we engage students. Now I'm going to shift gears and say a little bit about how we think about the pedagogy and the curricular transformation. But before I do that, I want to really hone in on this word that I've mentioned a few times, but really unpack it a bit. What do we mean by a culture of inclusion? And I'd like to just sort of look at it a slightly different way. You know, science, culture, and STEM is it. We can think of it sort of as an ecosystem. And you know, when you look at this picture, for example, on the left, what do you see? I mean, just you don't have to answer, but kind of think about what is it that is evident about this ecosystem that it makes it clear that this is an ecosystem that's thriving. So let's compare it to another environment where it's fairly clear that even if there is diversity in this environment, it is certainly not flourishing. And so the question is, what is the difference between this ecosystem, like the ecosystem, we can think of the ecosystem of science, or and the ecosystem here, where the diversity, what diversity there is certainly not being actualized. It means we have to ask ourselves some questions, right? How do we go from here to here? And one question we can ask is, you know, like how can we change the fish so that they're better able to survive in this environment? Uh, that's certainly one question one could ask. But if that's the way we're going to approach this question, it's very likely that we're setting ourselves up for failure. Another question is, more obviously, what's in the water that's creating such a stark difference between the ecosystem on the left and the ecosystem on the right? And it's sort of with that lens that I want to talk about some of the ways in which we've been asking that question. You know, what is in the water? What is our role in ensuring that the ecosystem, the environment, the culture is supportive of diversity and inclusion? So, in thinking of this question of how does one build a culture of inclusion, I've kind of brought back these images here again um, up at the top. So, there are a few key steps. One is, first of all, to just identify what the impact of the culture is. What is the culture? What is the impact? What is the outcome? In this case, for students, and then to challenge assumptions about what we see. And then there's a critical piece of self assessment and institutional assessment and reflection. And then finally, if we don't like what we see, then something's got to change. So these are the key steps that that we've been identifying to get from of diversity to a culture of real inclusion. And I'm going to give a specific example that we've been looking at, which is one of the challenges that I think happens in a lot of large research universities, where we look at the what is happening in lower division courses. And what we found was that there were significant grade disparities. In other words, if you look at students who are coming from socioeconomically underserved backgrounds, students who are coming from underrepresented groups, there were clear disparities in lower division courses. So, it's easy to hypothesize about why that might be. There are a number of assumptions, and one of the assumptions that I think is an easy first place to go is maybe the students from these underrepresented groups were just simply not prepared to excel. Um, and so then what is the solution? If that is the assumption, then that dictates the kind of solutions that we come up with. One would be, well, maybe we just have to fix the student. Or, maybe we just weed them out because they're not really ready, they're not prepared to excel. And so this was one of the challenges that, like many institutions, we have really grappled with. And so if you're approaching a tough scientific question, right, what do you do? You can make assumptions about why you get a particular set of results. Um, but nobody's going to publish that paper unless you actually do the analysis and then determine whether or not the assumptions or the models are correct. And so I will tell you a little bit about what form this takes, and this step of self-assessment and self-reflection. And I'll tell you a little bit about what form this took um, in this particular impact of the culture. So in late 2015, in 2015, the vice chancellor and provost at UCLA um, put together a committee that was comprised of the Dean of Life Sciences, Victoria, who I've introduced you to before, Victoria Sork, Silvia Hurtado, who some of you might know of, who is an extraordinary researcher in education with a background in higher education and educational equities, and a team of analysts to really ask the question, what is it that's leading to grade disparities, particularly on our campus? And the place where the largest disparities were found were in the STEM courses. And so the focus really was to understand why these disparities were perpetuated and particularly in STEM. And the observations, which I'll tell you the punchline here, were fascinating. Okay, so of course, one can assume that the problem is because the students are just not ready and they can't succeed. The other is the possibility that there is something in the way in which we are proceeding in our practices that are disproportionately affecting some students. And it turns out that a major contribution of this was the way faculty were grading. So this is an example of these are so thousands of courses across UCLA were analyzed, and these are some of the data for STEM courses that were graded on in a norm reference manner, or kind of what we think of colloquially as grading on a curve. And as you can see, there was this very clear um, disparity between the outcomes of students who were um, um, non underrepresented, not from underrepresented groups, and those students shown in red who are from underrepresented groups. It seemed as though there were two completely different classes. But these are for those classes that were norm referenced. When these were compared to the same courses that were graded in criterion reference manner, in other words, what students would call on a straight scale, the pattern is completely different. So there are assumptions that one can make about why there are particular outcomes, but unless you're willing to analyze the data, the solutions that you come up with will be running after the wrong problem. And in fact, it probably shouldn't have been surprising that that was the case. So this is consistent with data in the literature about adverse effects of norm reference grading. So the sense of kind of creating, all of us talk about how important it is to for science to be collaborative, for science to be interactive. I mean, that is what we profess, and yet um, the um, courses that were graded in this norm reference manner were creating cultures of hyper competitions that are completely counter to this idea of inclusion. In fact, it was sending the clear message that there were some students who were intended to succeed and some who weren't, and success was only going to be limited to a few. And so then the students who may come in with any sense of difference or maybe relative advantage or disadvantage are going to be particularly affected by the messages that we only want a limited number of students to succeed. Um, the idea of this kind of grading mechanism is typically thought to foster competition. And there's other data that shows that students, particularly those from underrepresented groups, tend to be more or less likely to embrace the competitiveness as a academic motivator. And so, really nice work from Claude Steele suggests that that is, in fact, the result. The result of that is that students self-distance as a coping mechanism, and that self-distancing can often either mean disengaging, um, or in some extreme cases, we find leaving the field. So the message from the faculty in this case is, this is our culture. This is the way we grade. You either adapt or get out. And then the response from the students was, okay, I'm out. And then the resulting message from, you know, faculty and the rest of the institution is, why is it that we lose so many students from underrepresented groups in STEM, when in fact, deeply looking at our own data and doing that self-reflection provides an answer, provides a really important answer. So back to this idea of of how do we build a culture of inclusion? First of all, identifying what is happening, identifying the impact. In this case, identifying that there were these grade disparities in lower division courses, and then challenging assumptions. First of all, being willing to unpack the assumptions, and then challenging them. Um, that requires self assessment, reflection, and frankly, collection and analyzing data. And many times when we think about, addressing um, issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we somehow treat them as if they're completely different from the way we approach other scientific or important, challenging questions. When in fact, we should be addressing these questions of why there are disparities with the same level of rigor that we would apply to our science. And then finally, the hard part, when we see it, it has to change. And this is really the place where the really really hard work is. And in fact, at UCLA, in the life sciences lower division courses, we are now moving toward 100% of those courses being graded, not in this norm reference manner, but on content based or on straight scales, which of course means a difference in the framework, the mindset, and the culture within which faculty think about their teaching. So finally, to the third part of the stool. So we've talked a bit about the student engagement, that we think about the way we engage students in their education differently, that we think about and understand how our pedagogy might be creating barriers to success, and the curricula might be creating these barriers. And finally, taking a deep look at what we as faculty might be bringing to the equation. So back to the kind of the aspirations of teaching and training students from diverse backgrounds, and then getting from there, from diversity to a truly inclusive learning and research environment. And I will say that I've highlighted some aspects that are focused on undergraduate education, but really in each of these cases, they apply also to the way we approach and think about graduate education as well, and the way we think about research environments. So, how do we go from diversity to true inclusion? How do we bridge this gap? How do we remove these barriers? So, the first step really is to acknowledge and understand what's happening between here and here. And a significant part of that is understanding and thinking about what, in fact, might we as scientists, as instructors, as faculty, what might we be bringing to this part of the equation? Again, personal and institutional assessment. So, what are some of the things in our analysis? What are some of the things that we find? And this is not unique, certainly, to UCLA, and it's not unique to really any academic institution. But there are many things simply because we live in a society that has grappled with racial and social inequities, that there are many things that we are quite possibly inadvertently bringing to the classroom. So I don't show you all of this to overwhelm you, and we're not going to have time, obviously, to unpack each of these individual contributors. But if this is exhausting to us, just looking at it, imagine the extraordinary cognitive load this is on students who have to navigate um, this kind of landscape. So the first step really is to recognize, then to own, and then to combat. So to get from here to here, the question is, what's in the water? How can we change it? And I'll tell you the third, I'll say a bit about a third strategy that has been part of this aspiration of cultural transformation, which are inclusive excellence institutes. And I'll tell you a little bit about what those are. So, for the last 5 years, we've had 2-day off campus, highly interactive training experiences with experienced facilitators to unpack what it is that might be happening. What are we bringing? What are the biases that might be coming into the classroom that might be affecting both the um, both the learning space as well as research spaces? These are based on cohorts where approximately there are 40 participants a year. There's a mixture of life sciences and physical sciences faculty, mostly faculty, some instructors, but the goal is that anyone who's teaching large undergraduate courses will engage in these 2 days of intensive thinking about what does inclusive education look like. And importantly, every year, both deans of life sciences and physical sciences participate. The goal is to really build a critical mass of faculty who are inspired to lead and to train to dismantle racism and bias. These workshops and institutes involve ally training, role playing intervention, really deliberately thinking about who we are and what we're bringing to the classroom and what is our role in um, dismantling biases. It's often, one of the questions that often comes up is if you are inviting faculty to participate, the ones who say yes, aren't you always singing to the choir? And what's been remarkable is that over the years, initially, of course, it's important to have key folks in the room, but it has been less and less over time that simply the choir or the people who are already thought to have bought in. It's become normative. The assumption is that at some point everybody participates. And I like this analogy to the choir because even if you're singing to the choir, or if the choir is assembled, The choir can only be effective if they know how to sing in the same tune. And so it's had both the effect of creating a community committed to dismantling um, uh, biases and racism, as well as bringing new folks into the conversation. One of the important pieces is that the groundwork is laid by having focus groups with faculty and students ahead of time to provide critical perspectives from um, BIPOC faculty as well as students. So this has now been taking place for the last 5 to 6 years, and I just want to share. And we've published a paper earlier this year describing the outcomes of these inclusive excellence institutes. But I'll just highlight a couple of the key findings. Now, one of the things I really want to highlight here is that what we've been really interested in thinking about is what is um, how do people change? And so the question about an increase in the awareness of one's own influence, one's own assumptions, judgments, biases, and the way that could influence a classroom or research environment or an academic culture. 96% of the participants, this is just from a snapshot from last year, 96 of those participants say that they're more likely to be aware of those after participating in these in the Inclusive Excellence Institutes. And I want to just take a step back because I know that there are a lot of conversations now about whether it's effective to have these types of focused concentrated thinking about issues of race and class and orientation and gender. Is it, what is the value of that? And what we're finding is that it's very clear that this focused attention really being guided by the values as articulated by leadership make a difference to the culture. So in asking rather how likely, so that's from the sense of awareness, how does that influence action? After completing the institute, the participants were asked, how likely are you to discuss diversity and equity and inclusion? How likely are you to make sure you self-educate about other groups? So 96%, 100% of the participants. How likely are you to avoid language that reinforces stereotypes? Over 90%. And this is one that I find particularly interesting. How likely are you to challenge others who make comments that are disruptive to the culture? And in that case, 100% of the respondents. And so I highlight this because, and that particular one, because at the beginning of the workshops, this is the particular intervention that people find most difficult, which is challenging a situation where you may not be the perpetrator, but how likely are you to intervene when you see something that your awareness, that your thinking and your education has made you aware of? So that's heartening. But one of the other uh, components of this is to really sort of think about what is the potential impact. So this has happened now. The first workshop was in 2015, and in that time, there have been over 40,000 students who have been educated by folks who have participated in the Inclusive Excellence Institutes. And so, what this says to us is that the potential for impact by focusing in on culture and what we and faculty and educators are bringing to the culture can profoundly impact the experiences of students. And so I want to say something in this that is critical, and that is that leadership is important. I mentioned that the deans of both life and physical sciences both organized and participated in. So they modeled the behavior that they expected, they incentivized it, um, and then the reward system is critical as well. So one of the questions that leadership um, is important to ask is, when we say we value something, is that in fact what is being rewarded? And so in this case, one of the ways to reward participation and active engagement in thinking about how we can change the culture in which we're educating students is happens at the level of tenure and promotion. And the deans have made it clear that participating in activities like this are considered during the promotion process. So if we say that activities that engage diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, but there's never an incentive or a reward system, then the disconnect means that these activities are destined to fail. So back to this overall picture, I want to just kind of bring us back to thinking about what does it take to achieve a culture, in this case, this culture of student success. Um, and I just want to remind you again of these three components, the way we engage students, the way we develop faculty, and the way we think deeply about what are the systems and structures in place at our own institutions that may need to be dismantled in order to achieve cultural transformation. And I will say this is really the result of an internal assessment at one particular institution. And these actually may look different for different institutions because of the particular needs. So a deep assessment of the particular landscape within which you operate is critical. And so I just like to leave you with this final idea that really diversity in this case, which is this kind of beautiful landscape here, diversity is pointless without a culture in which this diversity can thrive. And so how do we get from a culture of real inclusion? And I'd like to highlight just three key take homes. First, it requires honest and critical self reflection and institutional reflection. In most cases, it requires, in almost all cases, it requires resources and redeployment of resources and work, sometimes really hard work. If it was easy, we'd already be here. But it requires really data driven strategies that focus on changing institutional culture. And I'd like to highlight just these two words, which is the two things that have to come together, that there have to be strategies, but the strategies are meaningless unless there is a culture in which those strategies can be optimized. And and in thinking about how culture changes, it's particularly important for this culture change to be engaged by those, frankly, who've benefited from it and who are in the best position to dismantle barriers and change the culture. Why is culture critical in addition to strategy? And this comes from the world of marketing. And I think we've seen this, probably all of us in our own experiences, that no matter how good your strategy is, culture eats strategy every time. So both are critical to come together. But the good news is the combination of both strategy and culture to go from diversity to inclusion can really lead to institutional transformation. And with that, I would like to thank you all for sharing ideas with me, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.